On May 15, 1989, the Toronto Blue Jays needed a manager. They had opened the season 12-24, an unexpectedly bad start for a team built to contend, and Jimmy Williams had been fired. The job was offered to Cito Gaston. He turned it down. Gaston was comfortable as Toronto's hitting instructor. He would later tell Ebony, "When I was offered the job as manager, I didn't want it. I was happy working as the team's hitting instructor." Then the players encouraged him to reconsider. Gaston accepted, and the Blue Jays went 77-49 under him. They won the American League East. 3 years later, he would become the first African-American manager in Major League Baseball history to win a World Series. But the question that shaped his career began on the day he said no. What did those players see in Cito Gaston that he had not yet chosen for himself? Long before Toronto knew him as Cito, he was Clarence Edwin Gaston, born in San Antonio in 1944 and raised in San Antonio and Corpus Christi. His father drove a semi-truck, and Gaston grew up with two possible futures in mind. He could follow his father onto the road, or he could make the major leagues. Even the name that followed him into baseball came from those Texas years. Gaston later said he took Cito from a Mexican-American wrestler he watched as a boy. Another account says a friend named Carlos Thompson gave him the nickname because he resembled a well-known wrestler by that name. The origin remains unsettled.
The preference did not. He wanted to be called Cito, not Clarence. At 6'3" and 190 pounds, Gaston developed into a right-handed outfielder, primarily a center fielder. He reached the majors with the Atlanta Braves in September 1967, appearing in 9 games. Atlanta also placed him close to one of the most important figures of his life in baseball. Gaston was Hank Aaron's roommate. Years later, he credited Aaron with teaching him how to be a man, how to stand on my own. That influence belongs near the beginning of Gaston's story, because his own road would demand exactly that kind of independence. Nothing about his career would remain secure for very long. After the 1968 season, the expansion San Diego Padres selected Gaston from Atlanta. The Padres began play in 1969, wearing brown and gold in the enormous concrete bowl of San Diego Stadium. For Gaston, expansion meant opportunity. A player who had barely appeared in Atlanta now had a young franchise willing to put him on the field. Then came 1970. In San Diego, Gaston hit .318 with 29 home runs, 92 runs scored, and 93 runs batted in. He was chosen as a reserve for the National League All-Star team and named the Padres' most valuable player. For a second-year expansion club, those numbers gave fans someone to recognize as their own. A .318 average meant Gaston was producing a hit in nearly 1 of every 3 official at-bats, while supplying the power expected from the middle of a lineup. No Padre would post a higher batting average before Tony Gwynn arrived. If those early Padres clubs were part of your first experience with baseball, the colors may come back before anything else. Brown and gold against the pale concrete of San Diego Stadium, the sharp geometry of the artificial turf, and a new team still trying to establish what Padres baseball was supposed to look like. In 1970, Cito Gaston gave that new franchise an all-star summer. It looked like the beginning of something. Instead, it became the season the rest of his playing career could never match. Gaston never again hit more than 17 home runs in a major league season. He never again drove in more than 61 runs. The drop was not evidence that 1970 had been an illusion. The All-Star selection, the team MVP award, and the franchise batting benchmark were real. But the level could not be sustained, and the season that appeared to announce a star gradually became the exception by which every later year was measured.
His baseball life also extended beyond the major league schedule. Gaston played 310 regular season games in the Venezuelan Professional Baseball League, spending time with Cardenales de Lara, Navegantes del Magallanes, and Tiburones de la Guaira. He hit 31 home runs and drove in 207 runs there. Those winters were part of a career that required players to keep working and competing far from the summer parks where American fans knew them. There was a personal cost as well.
Gaston later cited his baseball career as the reason his first marriage ended in divorce. The game had fulfilled one of the two ambitions he carried out of Texas, but remaining in it demanded more than the box scores showed. He stayed with San Diego through 1974, then returned to Atlanta for the final 4 seasons of his major league career. By then, he was no longer the young center fielder whose 1970 numbers hinted at stardom. His work increasingly included pinch hitting, a role built around brief opportunities and long stretches of waiting. His last major league appearance came on October 1, 1978, against Philadelphia. Gaston received 1 at-bat and did not get a hit. At 34, his playing career was over. Had the story stopped there, Cito Gaston would have occupied a small but legitimate place in baseball history, an expansion Padre, a 1970 All-Star, and the owner of one remarkable season before Tony Gwynn transformed the franchise record book. His deeper importance would come from something his own statistics could no longer measure. By 1982, Gaston was back in the major leagues as the Blue Jays hitting coach. Toronto had hired him to help other players do what had once come together so completely for him in San Diego: recognize pitches, make adjustments, and turn ability into production. Hitting instruction also created a different relationship than managing. It placed Gaston beside players rather than above them. The work was individual.
Each hitter arrived with his own mechanics, confidence, habits, and problems. Gaston became known for dealing with players at that personal level, learning what each one needed instead of approaching an entire roster in the same way. Toronto's progress gave that work credibility. In 1985, with Gaston serving as hitting coach, the Blue Jays won the first division title in franchise history. The organization was growing into a contender, and Gaston had found a role that suited him. 4 years later, the expectations were higher. So was the disappointment. The 1989 Blue Jays were supposed to compete. Instead, they lost 24 of their first 36 games. When Jimmy Williams was dismissed, Toronto did not first turn to an established major league manager from outside the organization. The club offered the job to the quiet hitting instructor already inside the room. Gaston's refusal mattered. This was not a man openly campaigning for authority or treating the coaching staff as a waiting area for something bigger. He had spent years working directly with hitters, and by his own account, he was happy doing it. The players changed the equation. They wanted him to take the job. Their encouragement revealed something that could not be found in Gaston's playing record or job title. The people who would have to live with his decisions already trusted him. Gaston reconsidered and became Toronto's manager. Almost immediately, the direction of the season changed. The Blue Jays had gone 12-24 under Williams. Under Gaston, they went 77-49, a .611 winning percentage across the remaining 126 games. Toronto finished 89-73 and captured the American League East. A managerial change can sharpen a club for a few days. This lasted for more than 4 months. And while Gaston's team was changing, the physical world around the Blue Jays was changing with it. Only a few weeks after he took over, Toronto moved into SkyDome. The contrast with Exhibition Stadium was unmistakable. Baseball beside Lake Ontario had been exposed to the weather and fitted into a stadium that also had to serve football. SkyDome presented something entirely different,
artificial turf under a massive retractable roof, a giant video board beyond the outfield, hotel rooms looking into the park, and a sense that the city's baseball future had arrived all at once. When the roof was closed, the crowd noise gathered inside instead of disappearing into the open air. For those who watched the Blue Jays in 1989, the memory is larger than one pennant race. It was the feeling of seeing a familiar team enter an unfamiliar building and suddenly look like a major attraction. The television pictures were brighter, the scale was bigger, more people kept coming. Toronto began a run of 4 straight seasons leading the major leagues in attendance. In the middle of it stood a manager who had not wanted the job.
Gaston remained soft-spoken, but the position changed the reach of every choice he made. As a hitting coach, he could work privately with one player. As manager, he determined who played, who sat, when the bullpen moved, and how a roster responded when a season began to slip away. The 1989 turnaround gave Toronto an immediate answer. The players had been right to trust him. It did not yet explain how far that trust could carry them. The Blue Jays lost the American League Championship Series to Oakland, ending Gaston's first season one step short of the World Series. Now the reluctant replacement would have to return the next spring as the established manager of a contender. The emergency was over. The surprise had worn off. What came next would reveal whether Gaston had merely rescued one season, or whether the qualities that never made him a lasting star as a player could make him something far more consequential as a manager. In 1990, Toronto finished second behind Boston. A year later, the Blue Jays won the American League East again, only to lose the championship series to Minnesota. That gave Gaston 3 seasons as manager, 2 division titles, and 2 defeats at the final barrier before the World Series. The first turnaround could no longer be dismissed as a temporary response to a change in leadership. Toronto had become a regular contender. But regular season success was no longer enough. The organization now had resources few clubs could match. Attendance continued to climb inside SkyDome, setting major league records in 1990 and again in 1991. The financial success allowed Toronto to keep a core of all-stars and add established veterans. Joe Carter supplied power. Devon White covered center field. Roberto Alomar brought speed, defense, and an elite bat to second base. John Olerud became a fixture at first. Before the 1992 season, the Blue Jays added 2 more proven stars, pitcher Jack Morris and veteran slugger Dave Winfield. These were accomplished players with large salaries and clearly defined ideas about how to prepare and compete. Gaston's task was to give each one room to be himself without allowing individual status to pull the club apart. That was where his years as a hitting instructor mattered. Gaston had learned to work with players one at a time. As manager, he carried the same approach into a larger room. He was quiet and steady, and he communicated openly with his players. His authority did not depend on dominating every conversation. It rested on understanding when a conversation was necessary. There was another side to the job, one that could be obscured by the label players manager. Gaston still had to handle a bullpen, build a lineup, manage a bench, and adjust when postseason games moved to National League cities with different rules. Trust could hold a clubhouse together. It could not make October decisions for him.
By 1992, Toronto had reached the point where every success increased the pressure. The Blue Jays won 96 games and claimed their 3rd division championship under Gaston. This time, they made it through the American League Championship Series and into the World Series against the Atlanta Braves. For Gaston, the setting carried its own history. Atlanta was where his major league career had begun in 1967, where he had roomed with Hank Aaron, and where he had returned for the final years of his playing career. Now he came back as the manager of the American League champions. Across Toronto,
The World Series arrived through glowing television screens and radios carrying the games into kitchens, cars, and late October evenings. Inside SkyDome, more than 50,000 people could gather beneath the great white roof, facing the giant video board and the bright artificial turf. The franchise had spent years building toward this, through the first division title in 1985, the collapse of early 1989, and the postseason losses that followed. If you were a young fan in Toronto then, this may be where baseball first felt larger than the summer schedule. The Blue Jays were no longer simply the team that played every night. They were carrying a city, and eventually a country, into a World Series no team outside the United States had ever won.
The series required Gaston to manage road games under National League rules, where the pitcher batted and every substitution could alter what was available later. Toronto won 4 of its 6 World Series road games across 1992 and 1993. In the first of those series, the Blue Jays returned to Atlanta for Game 6 with a chance to end it. The night was loud, tense, and unfamiliar. The Braves were at home. The championship was within Toronto's reach, and every decision now carried the weight of everything the Blue Jays had failed to finish in earlier Octobers. Gaston managed through the National League conditions, through the road crowd, and through the final game of the longest season the franchise had ever played. When Game 6 ended, Toronto had its championship. The victory made the Blue Jays the first team from outside the United States to win the World Series. It also made Cito Gaston the first African-American manager in Major League history to win one. That distinction extended far beyond a single October. Baseball had existed as an organized Major League institution for more than a century, and no black manager had ever been allowed to stand where Gaston now stood. He had reached the position reluctantly, after his own players persuaded him to accept it. 3 years later, he had taken them to the top of the sport. Joe Carter believed Gaston's understanding of people had made the difference. Cito knows how to work with each individual, treating everyone like a human being, Carter said. He knows exactly what to say, when to say it, what to do, and how to go about doing it. Then Carter explained what that produced inside the clubhouse. We'd go to war for him. Toronto's first title could have been treated as the completion of the story. Instead, the roster changed dramatically before the next season. Dave Winfield was gone. So were starting position players Manuel Lee, Kelly Gruber, and Candy Maldonado. The pitching staff lost Jimmy Key, David Cohn, Dave Stieb, Tom Henke, and David Wells, among others. Toronto answered by bringing in another group of veterans, including Dave Stewart and Paul Molitor. The names changed. The demands on the manager did not. Gaston again had to define roles, manage accomplished personalities, and turn a collection of expensive talent into one team before the short postseason left no time for correction. The 1993 Blue Jays won 95 games and another division title. Then they won the American League pennant. Back in the World Series, this time against Philadelphia, they completed the repeat. 2 championships in 2 seasons placed Gaston's success beyond the reach of any claim that 1992 had been a one-time alignment of talent and timing. Toronto had lost a substantial portion of its championship roster, rebuilt around a retained core, and won again. And yet, at the height of that success, the public interpretation of Gaston remained more complicated than the view inside his clubhouse. As manager of the defending American League champions, he led the league's all-star team in 1993. Gaston selected 6 Blue Jays, drawing criticism that he had favored his own club. He refused to retreat. All 6, he pointed out, were world champions, and he predicted that 2 would eventually reach the Hall of Fame. Roberto Alomar and Paul Molitor did exactly that. But the sharpest reaction came during the All-Star game itself at Oriole Park at Camden Yards.
The ballpark was only in its second season, with red brick, green steel, and the long B&O warehouse beyond right field, giving Baltimore a modern park built from the visual language of the city. The stands were filled with Orioles colors, and the local crowd wanted to see its star pitcher, Mike Mussina. Mussina began warming in the bullpen during the ninth inning. Gaston did not put him into the game. Instead, he allowed Toronto reliever Dwayne Ward to close out the American League victory. From the seats, the sequence appeared obvious. The hometown favorite was getting ready, and the American League manager was refusing to use him. The crowd jeered Gaston. The hostility did not disappear when the game ended. Orioles fans later wore shirts declaring their contempt for him, and carried signs twisting Will Rogers' famous remark that he had never met a man he did not like.
Mussina later said he had simply been completing work between starts. But in the ballpark that night, many fans interpreted his warm-up as an attempt to force Gaston's hand. Anyone who remembers All-Star games from that period remembers how much local pride could gather around one appearance. Before interleague play became part of the regular schedule, the midsummer game still carried the feeling of two leagues meeting on distinct sides. To Baltimore, Mussina represented the home team on that stage. To Gaston, the responsibility remained his, and he made the decision he chose to make. The episode revealed how much had changed. 4 years earlier, Cito Gaston had been the hitting coach who did not want the manager's office. Now his selections, substitutions, and loyalties could provoke a ballpark full of anger. Winning had expanded his authority. It had also expanded the number of people prepared to challenge it. The championship years did not last. After 1993, the structure around Gaston began to change faster than the public memory of those titles. The players aged. World Series success increased salary demands. Founding owner Labatt was acquired by Interbrew in 1995, and the new ownership did not substantially raise the budget. General manager Pat Gillick left the organization, and Paul Beeston eventually left as well. Baseball's labor problems interrupted the 1994 season, while attendance began to fall from its record-setting heights. Toronto's roster had once been deep enough to replace championship players with other established stars. Now the club was caught between its recent past and a less certain future. It still tried to compete in the American League East, signing Roger Clemens before the 1997 season, but one major acquisition could not restore the complete machinery of 1992 and 1993. The results deteriorated. Toronto fell below 500 in 1994, lost 88 games in 1995, and remained under 500 in 1996. As the losses accumulated, Gaston's methods received a different kind of examination. One recurring criticism involved younger players. Sean Green and Carlos Delgado represented part of the Blue Jays' future, and Gaston was criticized for not giving them enough playing time. The issue reached beyond wins and losses. It raised a question about whether the manager, celebrated for handling veteran stars, could guide a club that now needed to develop its next generation. Then, in April 1997, the conflict became personal and public. Before a game, Gaston accused specific members of Toronto's sports media, Steve Simmons of the Toronto Sun, Dave Langford of the Globe and Mail, and radio host Bob McCown, of racism in their treatment of him. "There's a couple of sports writers who continue to take shots at me for no reason at all," Gaston said. "I just wonder if they would take the same shot at me if I was white." The source does not establish that every criticism directed at Gaston was racial or prove his accusation against the people he named. But the accusation itself cannot be separated from his place in baseball history. The first African-American manager to win the World Series believed that some of the judgment he faced was different because he was black. After that night's game against Oakland, Gaston offered one further statement. If something he had said unjustly offended someone, he apologized. If it had not, he said, then he did not apologize. He had not withdrawn the underlying concern. By late 1997, the relationship between Gaston and the organization was near its end. The Blue Jays could not remain above 500, and general manager Gord Ash faced a decision. Gaston accelerated it by telling Ash that he planned to take a vacation at the end of the season and would not attend the customary post-season evaluation. Toronto fired him with 1 week left. Pitching coach Mel Queen took over on an interim basis. The dismissal closed Gaston's first tenure with a regular season record of 683 and 636, plus an 18 and 16 postseason mark. Those numbers included 4 division titles, 2 American League pennants, and the only 2 World Series championships in Blue Jays history. A statistic could record the firing. Joe Carter supplied the human response.
For the remainder of the season, Carter wore Gaston's number 43 on his own jersey. It was partly a tribute and partly an expression of displeasure with the decision. Years after the players had persuaded Gaston to become their manager, one of the most important players from that era was still standing with him on the way out. For a 2-time World Series champion, the obvious expectation was another managing job. None came. Gaston was a final candidate for the Detroit Tigers position around the turn of the century. A few years later, the Chicago White Sox considered him alongside Ozzie Guillen. General manager Kenny Williams had played for Gaston in Toronto, but the White Sox chose Guillen. Other clubs offered Gaston opportunities to return as a hitting instructor, including Kansas City. He declined. He also turned down an opportunity with the Dodgers in 2004. After interviewing unsuccessfully for several managerial openings, Gaston said he would manage again only if a team hired him directly, without another interview. The position carried pride, frustration, and a practical consequence. He would not enter another lengthy competition to explain why 2 championships should qualify him to manage. Toronto remained the one organization that kept bringing him back. Gaston returned as a hitting coach after the 1999 season, although he was not retained after the disappointing 2001 campaign and the sale of the franchise to Rogers Communications.
In 2002, the Blue Jays hired him again, this time as a special assistant to team president Paul Godfrey. He was still connected to the club. He was not in the dugout. 11 years passed between Gaston's firing and his next major league managing job. For a World Series winning manager, let alone one who had won back-to-back titles, the gap was unusual. Then, on June 20th, 2008, the Blue Jays called on him again. Toronto dismissed John Gibbons with the team at 35 and 39. Gaston returned with a new coaching staff, stepping back into the only major league manager's office he had ever occupied. The setting now carried different names and a different mood. SkyDome had become Rogers Center. The attendance records and championship banners belonged to another generation of players. But number 43 was back in the dugout, and the immediate effect looked remarkably familiar. The Blue Jays went 51 and 37 for the rest of the season. Late in the year, they won 10 consecutive games. Toronto still finished 4th in the powerful American League East, but Gaston had again taken over a losing team and guided it to one of the better records in baseball over the remaining schedule. That performance earned him a 2-year extension through 2010. For a moment, the return seemed to settle the argument. Gaston could still manage. His effectiveness had survived the 11 years away. The next season made the answer less simple. Toronto opened 2009 by winning 27 of its first 41 games and moved into first place in the division. Then a sweep by Boston began a 9-game losing streak. The Blue Jays lost the division lead, fell below 500 by the All-Star break, and remained there. They finished 75 and 87. In October, Fox Sports writer Ken Rosenthal reported a clubhouse mutiny against Gaston, citing unnamed sources among players and coaches. The complaints included impatience after the team began losing, reduced playing time, negativity toward younger players, and poor communication about substitutions. The term mutiny was dramatic. The underlying concerns still required careful attention because one player addressed part of them publicly. First baseman Lyle Overbay said he had been surprised by a loss of playing time and wanted a better understanding of what to expect. "It kind of caught me off guard a little bit when I wasn't playing," he said. Of Gaston, Overbay added, "He never really said a lot." That criticism struck at the heart of the reputation Gaston had built in the championship years. Joe Carter had praised a manager who knew what to say and when to say it. Overbay described uncertainty and silence. Both accounts belonged to players who worked for Gaston. They came from different teams, different eras, and different circumstances. Gaston said he was surprised by the criticism. He argued that dissatisfaction among 2, 3, or 4 people did not mean he had lost the entire clubhouse.
If half the team had a problem, he said, then there would be a real issue to address. He also maintained that he had been as fair as he could be. The reported discord extended to the coaching staff. There were accounts of tension between holdover coaches from the previous administration, including pitching coach Brad Arnsberg and bench coach Brian Butterfield, and coaches associated with Gaston, including Gene Tennis. Arnsberg was later dismissed, while Tennis retired. So the conflict could not be reduced to a neat reversal in which Gaston had simply forgotten how to relate to players. A losing season had exposed divisions among players, coaches, and management, while expectations around communication had changed from the veteran championship clubhouses of the early 1990s. Toronto's new general manager, Alex Anthopoulos, kept Gaston for the final year of his contract. Gaston had already announced that he would retire after the 2010 season and move into a consulting role. The final year brought one more public confrontation. On June 1, broadcaster Mike Wilner challenged Gaston during a media scrum over decisions made on the field. Wilner described the argument on his blog. The following day, the Fan 590, owned like the Blue Jays by Rogers Communications, announced that Wilner would not cover the team for several days. The station did not say why, leaving the connection between the confrontation and the decision unconfirmed.
It was another reminder that Gaston's choices could still produce debate, even after nearly 2 decades had passed since the first championship. The 2010 Blue Jays were better than the year before. They finished 85 and 77, never leading the division after April, but also never falling far below 500. Gaston's last team ended with a winning record. On September 29, Toronto held Thank You Cito Night at Rogers Centre. The building itself carried the arc of his career. It had opened a few weeks after Gaston first became manager in 1989. It had housed the record crowds, the pennant races, and the 2 World Series championship teams. By 2010, the name had changed, and a newer generation filled the uniforms. But Gaston's number 43 and his name had already been placed on the Blue Jays' level of excellence. The ceremony offered a different sound from the criticism of 1997 or the discord reported in 2009. The ballpark screens carried the tribute. The field where Gaston had once managed Carter, Alomar, Olerud, and White now held the final home games of his career. Fans could look toward the place where the franchise honored him permanently, then back toward the dugout where he was preparing to leave. For those who lived through the Blue Jays' rise, this was a farewell to more than a manager. It recalled the first days under the retractable roof, when the crowds kept growing and Toronto baseball seemed capable of becoming something enormous. It recalled 2 October nights when the championship stopped belonging to a distant American city and came north for the first time. Gaston retired after the season with 894 victories and 837 losses as a Major League manager. He won 4 American League East titles, 2 pennants, and 2 World Series championships. Toronto later elected him to its level of excellence, and he entered the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame. In 2023, his name appeared on the National Baseball Hall of Fame's Contemporary Baseball Era ballot. But honors alone do not answer the question that began in 1989. The players wanted Cito Gaston to manage because they already knew what his playing statistics could not show. They knew the instructor who treated them as individuals. They trusted the quiet man who had spent years beside them, helping them make adjustments without demanding the spotlight. Once he accepted the responsibility, Toronto discovered that those qualities could hold together a roster of stars, and that Gaston could also handle the strategic demands of October. He benefited from exceptional talent and from an organization rich enough to acquire more of it. He also managed that talent through changing roles, major roster turnover, National League rules, and the pressure of repeated postseason failure. The second championship, won after so many players had left, made clear that Toronto's success could not be explained by one fixed group simply carrying its manager along. The years after the titles completed the picture. Organizational decline weakened the club around him. Questions about younger players damaged his standing. Gaston believed some criticism of him was racial. His relationship with management broke down, and 2 championships did not secure another immediate chance elsewhere. When Toronto finally brought him back, he produced another turnaround, then encountered a clubhouse whose complaints challenged the very strength for which he had once been celebrated. That complexity does not diminish the championships. It makes the career more honest. Cito Gaston's playing life had once seemed destined to be defined by 1970, an all-star season for an expansion team that he never approached again. His lasting place in baseball emerged only after that path had closed, and after he agreed to take a job he had never wanted. The name Clarence gave way to Cito. The outfielder became an instructor. The instructor became a reluctant manager. And the reluctant manager became the first black man ever to lead a major league team to a World Series championship. When Toronto said thank you in 2010, it was honoring the defining manager of the greatest era in Blue Jays history. All of it began because his players saw the manager before he did.